Morning. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the following public debate organized by the Polish Institute of International Affairs, Brussels office. This time we'll focus on a vital and so timely discussion on the nature, goals, and countering policy against Russian and Chinese disinformation campaigns regarding the war in Ukraine provoked by Russia. I would highlight that this is also the following public debate, the ninth, in fact, of our Brussels office, who deals with the consequences of the Russian aggression against Ukraine. We have tackled this issue from different angles, from sanctions on Russia, military and political support for Ukraine, its accession to the EU, up to the energy crisis. And if we add a similar number of debates that had been organized by our headquarters in Warsaw, this all shows our institute's focus on not only better understanding the war and its outcomes for Europe and globally, but also our considerable support for Ukraine that has been brutally attacked and which has been fighting so bravely for its sovereignty for almost 10 months already. Indeed, giving the opening remarks is the easiest of today's task. That's why, at first place, I would like to thank Agnieszka Leguska, our key expert on Russia, who's not only and will be the laborious moderator of our today's debate, but also the main impulse giver to organize such a discussion today in this format. By the way, for those who would like to chat with Agnieszka about her recent publication on disinformation narratives, in particular what goes for the Chinese role and goals and its cooperation with Russia in spreading the false anti-West, anti-NATO, anti-U.S. narratives. I would like to also welcome our Impulse respondents, both our dear panelists, who will be introduced in details by Agnieszka next, and all gathered in person and online participants. Thank you all for accepting our invitation. Are there any differences in spreading false information and messages between Beijing and Moscow in the context of Russia's invasion of Ukraine? How effective are the Chinese and Russian disinformation campaigns regarding this war? And what is our level of resilience, possible countering policies to China-Russia narrative warfare? These, among others, will be the key questions of our discussion. Now I'm passing the floor to Agnieszka, who will also introduce in more details the angles of our debate. I wish you all a fruitful, frank, fascinating discussion. Thank you so much. So please join the panel.
Okay,
Take a seat.
thank you. Hello? Hello? Does my mic work? Okay, works. Okay, thank you very much for a great introduction. I will have an honor to moderate this this fantastic debate and with great speakers. Martyna Bildziukiewicz, head of the East Stratcom European External Action Service. Thank you for accepting our invitation. Justyna Szczudlik, Deputy Head of Research Office at PISM. She is responsible for our Chinese everything what is connected with China, foreign and domestic policy. That's why we decided to somehow compare China and Russia propaganda and disinformation messages regarding Ukraine, because first impression from exactly Russian intervention in Ukraine, I mean, from my point of view, was the exactly as a researcher on Russia information and let's say disinformation propaganda research was exactly pandemic time, because due to pandemic time I watched that Russia was repeating Chinese propaganda about biolabs, about the origin of pandemic and etc. So, but actually regarding the war in Ukraine, Chinese started to repeating false messages about what is going on in Ukraine. So that's why I decided to invite Justyna Szczudlik, who is, from my perspective, one of the best experts in Poland on China, to exactly compare those propaganda and disinformation messages to also for you to decide whether China or and Russia cooperating with each other in this propaganda and disinformation messages. And also I invited Grigor Julukhidze, the director of Foreign Policy Council in Georgia, also the author of the book Russia Empire of Propaganda, exactly to insight a bit deeper to how Russia is involved in the propaganda messages in Europe, in the central also Europe, but also in the how Russia is dealing with the messages in the eastern part of Europe, but also in the western part of Europe. Myself, I am a researcher on East program at PISM. I am editor of this book. As promised, please, the person who will come to me with this special message will receive this book after the debate. Also, who could not come, I'm sending a message to those who are watching us on YouTube. You can also send us questions or comments. I will check on my mobile your comments and questions. I will have this opportunity. Leave us likes to not only spread this information, but also spread or share very important debate, actually this debate. So I will not leave much more my monologue. I will go exactly to our debate. So I will start from the very beginning about these different narratives that exactly Russia is starting, and then I will go further to compare Chinese narratives. So I will start from the Russian narratives, and I will start with Martyna Bildziukiewicz. Maybe I will. Okay, it's working now. So how it started and how it's because those narratives are changing due to from the beginning of this new invasion, and we know exactly how those narratives can be, from our perspective, sometimes absurd, sometimes very difficult to understand. Can you elaborate for us those changes in this, in the sense how these narratives were, how they changed due to time?
Gladly, and thank you for having me. Good morning, everyone. So I will actually start by saying that the narratives don't change that much, actually. When we look at the, say, 3 or 4 most peddled most used narratives used by Russia, I mean, to justify its war of aggression, to justify its war crimes, those are as follows. The first one, and I'm sure you've all heard this before, it's about Nazi Ukraine, about Ukraine being allegedly ruled by Nazis and hence the need for Russia to denazify Ukraine. The second one is about genocide that Ukraine actually is allegedly committing against Russian citizens. The third one is about what you mentioned already, Agnieszka, about biological laboratories that are allegedly somewhere in Ukraine, financed by American money, and they work on some kind of biological weapons that will destroy people of Russian ethnicity. The fourth one, I think, one of the most prevalent ones, is about refugees and immigrants. So those that are fleeing the war and are coming to mostly EU countries and are bringing all sorts of evil with them. The thing is, all of those narratives have been used for years. These are not new at all. One of the things that we do as East Stratcom Task Force, and you may know this, is a collection of disinformation cases that you can find on EU versus Disinfo website. We have been doing this since 2015, every week. And of course, our approach evolved a little bit with time. We got more funding for this, so we were able to expand our scope of monitoring. But what has not changed throughout all this time are those main narratives, really. So if I were to sum up Russian disinformation also targeting, well, used to justify the aggression against Ukraine, this is an exercise in recycling for me. I have seen this all before. And the narratives about Nazi Ukraine and about genocide are at least 8 years old, actually. They actually were coined when the Euromaidan revolution started in Kiev. And they were used ever since, really. Russia has been using it every time it saw an opportunity to actually peddle this. And of course, the magnitude, the amount of messages about exactly that has increased significantly. But the same goes for this narrative about genocide against Russian people in Ukraine and by Ukraine. So this started also in late 2013, early 2014. It was used already when Russia attacked the east of Ukraine back in 2014. And it then evolved to describe the situation in the whole of Ukraine, not only in the east of Ukraine. The Nazi narrative also evolved a little bit in the sense that when Russia attacked in February, it was trying to make us believe that it's the Kiev government that is Nazi. And then it evolved, also showing, in my opinion, signs of desperation and trying to tell us that it's not only the government, it's actually the whole of Ukraine. So basically every Ukrainian person is Nazi. And then it evolved even more to now to say that basically Russophobia is Nazism as well. So if you are saying things like I do, for example, right now, I would be called by Russia a Nazi person and a Russophobic person because, well, basically I'm telling the truth. So for me, this is also a sign of desperation. I'm not going to speak for a very long time anymore, but the point I really want to make here is, if it was all so predictable, we should be already resilient, right? We should all know this by now. The problem is, however, that Russia, what is really evolving is not the narratives, but the whole set of tactics, techniques, and procedures that are behind this information. So we are talking about the whole industry of Russian disinformation, where all those proxies, social media accounts.
I will get back to it in a moment, because I understand that those narratives were not changing much, but they were adding some elements, new elements, because they were not winning this battle, right? So, for example, they were adding some new elements, because from my perspective, they add the Satan, right? The devil in Ukraine, because that was something new. I mean, they were fighting with devil there, the Satan. That was something that I never had before, right?
Spoiler alert, I have heard this before, actually.
Okay.
Not to that extent as we see right now. And again, for me, this is a sign of desperation of Russia's disinformation machine, because really the Nazi narrative didn't work very well, apparently, anywhere outside of Russia, basically. And so I see it as a next stage of desperation, really. So now we're talking about, yes, desatanizing Ukraine, basically. And I see also the same pattern now in Belarusian disinformation, because, well, obviously they work very closely together, those two systems. So yes, I wonder what is next. What next to Satan, so to speak, as absurd as this may sound, a group or a group that is also targeted, and the set of values that are targeted with it is the LGBT community, which also happened many times before, but now this is being picked up because apparently Russia needs new enemies.
Yeah, we will get back to it, and of course it's forbidden now in Russia, because they are fighting with it in Russia very harshly. But okay, I will go to exactly to China, because this is the point of our debate. Have you heard now, when you hear Martyna Bieldziukiewicz, do you hear any kind of in Chinese debate, narrative, any similarities that China is spreading in their propaganda messages in the world, or in exactly to its own people?
Thank you very much, Agnieszka, and good morning to all of you here and watching us on YouTube. First of all, I would like to say that listening what Ms. Bieldziukiewicz said about Russia's disinformation and these topics, I would like to say that China is more sophisticated, and it is the reason why we think that China is neutral when it comes to the narrative and it comes to relations with Russia. Why? Because, and one issue I would like to underscore, that what I'm following is the official narrative. I'm not focusing. It's impossible for one person just to follow all these Chinese social media, Chinese press, all of that. I'm following Chinese official remarks on Chinese MFA, readouts published after meetings from Xi Jinping or Wang Yi with leaders, Western, not only Western, but also sometimes Jamin Zhipao, which is the main, let's say. Press organ of the CCP. So this is one important issue, that maybe some kind of similar communication may find somewhere on social media or some in other sources, but I would like to focus on following an official narrative. So referring to these four points that was presented when it comes to Russia about Nazism, genocide, biolabs, U.S. biolabs, and refugees, I would like to say that in Chinese case, what China is talking about is U.S. biolabs, for sure. And this is extremely interesting, because what China is talking about is exactly the same as Russia. It's like a translation from Russian press or remarks given by Russian officials, that they are U.S. biolabs, they are viruses stored there, and it is, of course, for military purposes. And it is. It's really strange. It's really strange for me that it is because they are biolabs. They are very dangerous for Ukrainian people, but also for Russian people, because it's very close to the Russian border. So it's like translation from from Russian sources, and refugees, in a sense that because of the sanctions that Western countries, U.S., EU. And to be frank, EU imposed sanctions because US told us to do so, because we are very emotional when it comes to the Russia's aggression, is the Chinese some official remarks.
So let me stop here.
So about these refugees, that they are refugees because we impose sanctions on Russia. So there is a problem with energy, with food. The food crisis. It's because of that. We have refugees, wave of refugees here. So this is not the results of Russia's invasion, but is the results of sanctions imposed by Western countries on Russia.
I will only underline one thing, that Russia is very highlighting that U.S. the West is divided on that European Union or Europeans are in the hands of American.
So the same story in
marionettes.
case of China.
Like the Ukrainians are not sovereign nation, Europeans are also not sovereign in their decisions.
Yep.
In the hands of Americans, right? Like marionettes.
Yes,
right?
exactly. Because I refer to these 4 topics. So now, if I may just very briefly about main narrative from Chinese side about the, let's say, war in Ukraine or Russia's aggression, because there is, I think, this unofficial narrative. There is no something about Nazism or genocide. No, there was at the very beginning. China Daily, I remember, published something that there's a denazification process, but it was once and just after the invasion. But about the main topics, I think that it's important to underscore because it's very sophisticated, and very often we as experts, but also journalists, we misinterpret or overinterpret what China is saying. So 3 main topics is about what China is talking about Ukraine, what China is talking about Russia, and what China is talking about collective West, let it put in this way. And the very important issue when it comes to Ukraine, that China is not, when it's talking about Ukraine, is not saying Ukraine full stop, Ukraine as a country. China is talking about Ukraine issue, Ukraine conflict, Ukraine problem, Ukraine crisis. So this is first thing. But very often it's talking about Russia. Russia did something, or Russia, we should take into account Russian security considerations or something like that. So Ukraine is like Ukraine issue. Ukraine is an adjective, not a subject. The second one is that China refrains, and I think it's very important because we are very often Western say that China expressed its respect for Ukrainian sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence. It is not true. What China is saying is China respects sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of all countries.
Not naming
saying
Ukraine.
Ukraine. But the next sentence is Russia is concerned about something like that, So the fact is very important. And also very interesting topic is that Russia is not portrayed as a victim of aggression, at least Russia's aggression. Ukraine is a how to say it, is a victim of a plot by the Western countries and the U.S. Because Ukraine would like to be part of the Western institutions, EU and NATO, and it is not Ukrainian decision, but it was kind of a pressure from the U.S. on Ukrainian government to apply for the membership. So what Russia is doing, Russia is feeling putting in a corner and must defend. So the West is responsible for the situation in Ukraine. And very shortly, what China is talking about Russia. So Russia is an independent country, should defend itself because there is a NATO expansion, even not enlargement, endless expansion. And NATO in that sense is not defensive but offensive alliance. And very often, let me quote, because it is often repeated by the Chinese MFA spokesperson, they like very much to quote John Mearsheimer, comment that if you take a stick and you poke a bear in the eye, the bear is probably not going to smile and laugh at what you are doing. The bear is probably going to fight back. And this quotation is used very often. Similar time I read it by the Chinese MFA, and I said about this biolabs, but also very important issue is that China is using the slogan that Russia is also using very often recently about principle of indivisibility of security, which is taken from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe lexicon, but it's completely new in Chinese narrative. I tried to find this kind of, in Chinese language, this kind of phrase in 2021, 2020, 2019 is very difficult to find, but China started to use it since this year or the end of 2021, because it is Russia plays this kind of using this kind of narrative, this slogan or this principle, in order to change the security system in Europe. And China parroting, repeating this kind of principle of indivisibility of security. On the first side, it's okay. It's from the Organization for Security and Cooperation Europe lexicon taken from, but it's a kind of endorsing Russia to change the security landscape in Europe. So this is, I think, we should really be very careful listening what China is talking about and reading what China is writing about, because it's very sophisticated. It's not like straightforward like Russia that Ukrainians are Nazis, and maybe later on about some nuclear threats. So I'll stop here.
Yeah.
And just the one sentence, generally speaking, when it comes to the Western, the West is responsible for what is going on right now in Ukraine.
Okay, so actually summarizing your thoughts is just China is following Russia agenda when it comes this narrative regarding Ukraine. Okay, so when we are saying like this, Grigol, if so, when you hear that kind of narrative, so what's Russia's aim? What kind of aim Russia is having when it comes to those goals Russia is having, not only internally, because internally, I suppose, we are clear about, but how about these external aims of Russia propaganda?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that Russian propaganda right now has two dimensions, internal and external. And the concept of Nazism and fascism dates back to 2008, when the Russian Federation tried to invade Georgia. And I remember the narrative of the Russian Federation at that time, that the fascism was in the trend of the Russian TV stations. The fascist Georgia tried to, let's say, destroy small nations like Ossetia and Abkhazia. And as for the internal dimension of the Russian propaganda, we can say that the war is already won there. This is the only war that Russia is winning right now. And that's why I keep saying that if the Russian propaganda had said on February 24 that we're going to defend Ukrainians from the invasion of Martians, I'm pretty sure that the most part of the Russian society would have believed in it. But it is not important. Important is the external dimension, foreign dimension of this propaganda. The aim of the Kremlin disinformation machine is to, first of all, discredit Ukraine and present this country as a Nazi state, which is slaughtering its Russian language citizens. Another important aspect and topic in this information operation is the demonization of the West, morally bankrupt West, which is pushing various countries like Ukraine, which is not, by the way, according to the Russian propaganda, is not a country, Georgia, Moldova, to the war, which will be against the war, which will be against the interests of Moscow and of the conservative country, which is called the Russian Federation. Another important issue and topic of this information war is the, let's say, destruction of transatlantic relations between the United States of America, the EU, the NATO. Also, we have to focus on the dissemination of various conspiracy theories, which work much more effectively than the reports provided by fact checkers, because if such kind of narratives are repeated over and over by some pseudo-information agencies or TV channels like RT, or let's say information agency like Sputnik over and over in a high emotional volume, it is much possible that people will believe in it. And the first effects are always very important from this direction and from this point of view. Another topic and another objective of the Russian propaganda is the dissemination of Russian narrative and Russian way of thinking in the countries where traditionally the interest towards our region, towards Ukraine and the Eastern Europe is historically low. This is Latin America, Africa, and I remember from my personal experience when I was preparing my lecture for Buenos Aires University, I was asked what topic you're going to focus on. I told Russian propaganda, and their answer was, what does it mean? It means that the visibility of this issue is quite low. Apart from that, the RT, Spanish language TV channel, is operating there quite effectively. And I would say that the last point of the main objective of the Russian information operation is the dissemination of the principle that Russia was obliged to respond. And I remember the utopistic narratives of Solovyov, Simonian, and other leading Russian propagandists about the motives of the war. And according to their narrative, Russia was obliged to start this military operation in order to avoid the war. Unfortunately, this concept is quite acceptable for many Russians.
Okay. I personally like this analogy that you made, that Russia would even attack. I mean, they would believed in Martians, but I think that it was quite wise from Putin that he compared Ukrainians to Nazis, because or this war in Ukraine he compared to Great Patriotic War, because for 75% of Russians, this Great Patriotic War was one of the greatest moment in their life. So from that perspective, for many Russians, actually, they believe that they are fighting with Nazis in Ukraine. So for propaganda, they scratch Ukraine from news. Like in Harry Potter, they cannot name Voldemort because naming something is giving the something or someone, right? Mm-hmm. So that's why they, for example, they cannot name Ukraine, so they call Ukrainian regime, Kievian regime on Banderovцы or something like this. Mm-hmm. So that's why I like it. But yes. Nazis, it's something meaningful for Russians, right? Sure. So I think internally it's very meaningful. For us, it's like fighting with Nazis. It's like, come on, yes. We are not living in the 40s. We are living in 21st century. But for Russians, it's really something right now. For that's why it's so big issue.
Sure, that's a meta-narrative created by the Russians, and one of the worst parts of my activities to follow Russian televisions at this time, and not only in Russian but in different languages, and this is a meta-narrative which is used quite oftenly there. And it comes to my mind the marvelous article of Gary Steingart, who in 2014 spent 2 weeks in the New York City hotel, and during this period, he was watching only Russian TV stations, and he describes his emotions and opinions with his psychotherapist. And his transformation over these 2 weeks is really impressive. On the 13th day of this experiment, he misses Putin. Where is he? That's why it is quite understandable why the Russian propaganda is effective inside the country. And as for the words like invaders, Karadeli, Banderovцы, the supporters of Bandera Group, and let's say Nazis, are very, let's say, sensitive terms for the local society, for local Russians. And it has very long tradition, which dates back from the communist era, and it is kept right now today. And according to the recent opinion polls conducted by Levada Center, which is one of the most reliable sources left in Russia, more than 75% of Russians support these so-called military operations. And from my personal point of view, more than 200,000 Russians fled the country, and they are on the territory of Georgia, as they call themselves, as refugees, but they are not refugees. Most of them escaped because it is quite uncomfortable to live in Russia right now, and they escaped from the partial military operation. It does not mean that they do not support Putin. It does not mean that they are against all this military operation. Do you know how many mass demonstrations were organized in Georgia over these past 9 months by Russians? 0. But we see the ongoing demonstrations of Iranians who are against of the regime. That's a huge difference between the Russians and other nations.
Okay, Martyna Bildziukiewicz. Now I go to next part of our discussion about the effectiveness of Russian and Chinese disinformation and propaganda part, because European Union very quickly blocked the main source of Russian disinformation. Let's say media very quickly decided rightly that RT and Sputnik are spreading disinformation messages. That was very good. But actually, Russia did not reduce financing RT and Sputnik. So also Russians somehow decided to adapt to the new situation. So how they are adapting to the new situation? Because from my observation, at least they are, let's put it like this, they use the Twitter diplomacy. The diplomats are very active in the propaganda. How, from your perspective, it looks like after the invasion?
Thank you. This actually allows me to pick up where I left off when I was previously speaking. So the industry of disinformation. I think this is really the most important point to understand the whole disinformation as used by Russia. We are not talking only about Russian media outlets, so-called media. We are talking about a really global operation of outlets that operate in every part of the world, very active, for example, in Latin America, as mentioned already. We are talking about proxies. We are talking about media, so-called media or websites or social media accounts that at the first glance do not have anything to do with Russia, actually. You really need to scratch the surface to actually realize how they are connected. We are talking about politicians, about diplomats, indeed. And I'll get back to that very shortly. We are talking even about Russian Orthodox Church. So really the whole ecosystem that speaks the same language. And by that, I don't mean actually Russian language. I mean what is being said, and doing it globally. So when we realize that, we will also realize that we can probably never achieve the point where there will be no disinformation. There will always be disinformation, but what we can do and what we keep trying to do, and I think this year we've been fairly successful, is we can try make it much more difficult to disinform and manipulate. And so the sanctions, in my view, were an effective tool to do exactly that. And of course, blocking Russia Today, RT, and Sputnik, and several other outlets, by the way, and the list is not closed. And also a few, around 20 people, individuals that are peddling disinformation narratives, they are also listed already. This does not mean that disinformation as coming from Russia will just go away, will be erased totally. But we made it more difficult. And I think the increased financing of the whole ecosystem is also a sign that they need to try harder and harder to actually get at least to the European Union. And I don't have any illusions. We know very well that there are mirror websites that are using exactly the same content, and they are popping up with the same disinformation narratives. However, the member states which are actually responsible for, carrying out the sanctions, for making them work on their turf, they are really doing better and better to chase those that are on the sanctions list, that are sanctioned. And also, well, we know much more than we did a few years ago about how Russia's disinformation is working and how it uses all sets of tactics, techniques, and procedures. However, yes, going back to what I called the biggest problem, the biggest challenge that we are still facing, the way disinformation narratives are finding their way to our feeds, to our media, also to mainstream media, well, and basically everywhere we look for information. One of the tactics that we unveiled this year, and this is one of the most worrying ones, is the diplomatic accounts on social media peddling disinformation narratives. And it may not be as surprising given that, Russian diplomats, Russian officials have been using disinformation narratives for a very long time. But now it seems that they have gone much further with those attempts. And I would even say that disinformation is basically part of the job right now. So one of the most worrying trends that we unveiled this year regarding exactly that is how those accounts are actually promoting initiatives that pretend to be fact-checking. They are not. There is a website called War on Fakes. There are several other websites that also pretend to be fact-checking disinformation about Ukraine, but they create kind of a twisted world where disinformation is portrayed as facts and facts as disinformation. And then those diplomatic accounts promote certain hashtags like think for yourself, see for yourself, promote this particular website, which comes in several languages, and really kind of try to give credibility to this tactic of disinformation, and then also give themselves more credibility because they promote fact-checking. And this is just one of many, many tactics, techniques, and procedures that we saw this year. So this is a constant battle and a constant kind of reinventing of ways to approach us, to manipulate us, to influence us.
Fantastic. I mean, fantastic from the research point of view, of course.
Can I say
yeah,
one more
sure.
thing? I'm sorry, because I wanted also to say a few things about the effectiveness, as you mentioned. I mean, I'm sure we will go back to it, so I don't have to say anything at once, everything at once. But I want to go back to what Justyna was saying about Chinese ecosystem promoting the narrative of NATO expansion. I think actually this is one of the most effective Russian narratives ever. And it has been used for years. We're not talking 2014 even. We're talking early 1990s, basically. And this is a narrative that made it to the mainstream a long time ago. And you can see even think tanks, very respectable ones, also, I'm not going to name names, also using this narrative. And especially when you go outside of Europe, you'll be confronted with this. But really, this is about the whole war that we are facing, that we are seeing right now. It is also about NATO expanding eastwards, and NATO made this promise to Gorbachev still that it will never expand to the east, and this is why this war is happening. So this is something that really being repeated over and over again on as many channels as possible for so many years. It made its way to the mainstream, and this is still something that we need to respond to.
If I may advertise one of the articles in this book, written by Robert Kupiecki, is exactly about the treason from the West, which is exploited by Russia, about how the West was made by exactly NATO expansion, so-called expansion to the east. Okay, if we were talking about Justyna Studlik, so we go back to you about this effectiveness and also about the different effectiveness, because effective narratives, because we were also discussing this issue between ourselves before,
because we are sitting in the same office, so this is pretty easy to communicate. And the reason why this is the topic of today's discussion.
Yeah, because sometimes, especially when we were discussing the issue about nuclear blackmail of Russia, especially, because when Putin was talking about exactly, I remember our discussion very well, was talking about nuclear threatening. I remember that you were reading the headlines of the article, and you were saying no one is reading the article, everyone is reading only the headlines. So can you elaborate this issue about everyone is reading only the headlines, no one is reading what exactly Chinese is having in the statements?
Yeah, so this is my main message, that we should really read what China is writing and what China is talking. And of course, the best option is to read in Chinese, because sometimes I think it's a misinterpretation, overinterpretation, mistranslation. So referring to the question about the effectiveness, I would like to say 4 points in which I think China is effective. Effectiveness in a sense that, in my understanding, in the Western or the collective West media, expert circles and leaders. I think that, and I will also say a few words about this nuclear threatening and this kind of stuff that we are discussing in the latest few weeks. First of all, the fact that China still is perceived by several leaders that China's stance on Russia's invasion is neutral. I think it is a kind of China's victory. That still China is perceived as a neutral, that does not support Russia in an explicit, open way. So this is the one issue. The second one, that China could be a mediator, because it's neutral. So China could be a mediator, and why this kind of thinking is pretty popular, because because China appeals for ceasefire, peace talks, humanitarian assistance, which is a little bit ridiculous, because China sent Chinese humanitarian assistance to Ukraine 15 million renminbi, which is 2.2 million US dollars, so which is almost nothing. And I would like to pay attention that calling for ceasefire, okay, but what China does not say that Russia should stop using attacks and so on. There is ceasefire. Just we are calling for ceasefire without any addressee that it is Russia who is aggressor. This is also the clue. And peace talks. Calling for peace talks. This kind of appeal serves Russia, because it's and why it's effective. I will get to give you an example. What happened in G20 summit in Bali in November, and this kind of, let's say, China's smiling diplomacy. I call it smiling diplomacy because Xi Jinping met with Biden, with Macron, with Rutte, with also Prime Minister of Australia, with a smiles. And there was some talks about nuclear weapons, and there was so, wow, wonderful, China condemned Russia, China is smiling, so now it's better we can cooperate with China. And Macron said that he would like that China could be a mediator. So this is my understanding that is in that sense China's disinformation and propaganda as a narrative about Russia's invasion of Ukraine is effective. And if I may, just a few words about this nuclear threatening. And let me quote some kind of titles of articles published in Europe and the United States after this G20 summit, also in Bali, but also after Chancellor Scholz's visit to China. 4 or 5 titles. China rebukes Russia's nuclear threats in Ukraine for the first time. Xi Jinping and Li Keqiang is the Prime Minister. Xi and Li condemned Putin's nuclear threats. China's Xi warns Putin not to use nuclear arms in Ukraine. Xi Jinping joins Joe Biden in condemnation of Russian nuclear threats of Ukraine. China and Germany condemned Russia's threat to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine. You know why it's effective, why China is effective in this disinformation? Because when you read exactly what Xi Jinping has said about nuclear weapons, there is no word Russia. So this is very blurred, very vague sentences that international community should condemn the threat, should not threaten using using nuclear weapon. So it's a very general. But when you look what China is writing about this nuclear threatening, is whitewashing Russia, because I found an article in Zhenmin which is People's Daily, the main press organ of a Chinese Communist Party. It's an explanation that Russia is restrained, that Russia is a defensive mode, that Russia should be defensive, is a kind of a justification if Putin decides to use nuclear weapons. So really, anywhere, you cannot find anywhere in an official Chinese remarks published by MFA after Xi Jinping's meeting with Biden. By the way, when you look at this readouts after Xi Jinping-Biden meeting in Bali, there's any sentence about nuclear weapons threatening. No, zero. But there is a kind of a sentence in a readout after Wang Yi, Minister of Foreign Affairs of China, and Lavrov meeting. And was the sentence that Russia is restrained, that is a very good position when it comes to nuclear weapon, it comes to Russia, because Russia is in a defensive mode, will use as a first country. It's a whitewashing Russia right now, and also kind of a thinking that maybe it is the West who is threatening using the nuclear weapons in Ukraine against Russia. You know, this is a very important, we should read exactly what is written in Chinese remarks and in Chinese mostly. So it is our work as a Chinese expert to convey the message, to translate and to disseminate, to spread this information, what is exactly in these characters, what Xi Jinping, Wang Yi is talking about Russia and Ukraine and West and nuclear weapons and ceasefire and peace talks.
Okay, the last question to Lukize Grigol. The same actually about the effectiveness of Russia propaganda and disinformation. I know the differences. We will not give to the definition, but perhaps you would like to. In Europe, but you actually tackle about different regions. Perhaps you would like to develop those elements where exactly, or maybe conditions which we should maybe highlight in which this effectiveness can work actually in the sense of Russia propaganda or disinformation. And also, I encourage others because I know that we are watched. Sorry to look at my mobile. I'm not bored on this this information. Our debate. I'm looking for some. I'm gathering your questions, and I also will encourage you to have some because after our round of questions, I will also encourage you to ask some. Yeah.
Well, for the Russian propaganda, the golden age was the period of COVID-19, because at that time, different pro-Russian channels, pseudo-information agencies, agents of influence got a huge credibility because they were highlighting the things that the Western televisions were not talking about. Especially, they were quite successful in spreading various myths about the negative side of the vaccination. 8 out of 10 disinformation narratives in certain regions were very effective from this point of view. And from then on, Russia is quite effectively using these different sources to explain to the world its point of view, especially after February 24. So what are the main reasons for the efficiency of these disinformation narratives and propagandistic messages? First of all, the popularization and the huge popularity of internet news agencies. People prefer to get the information from so-called alternative info sources, and from this point of view, as I already mentioned, COVID-19 period was very successful because certain people who became useful idiots explored a new continent because there were some alternative information and explanation of at that time some affairs that were going on. From this point of view, the popularization of these alternative info resources are critical because since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, more than 400,000 fake accounts were created only in Eastern Europe, according to the calculation of our research, which was conducted with different Georgian think tanks. Moreover, trolls, bots are coordinating the various narratives according to which the Russian Federation was obliged to answer, and it becomes more convincing when different entities like the Orthodox Church, especially in the countries where the Kremlin has quite close contacts and relations owing to the common religion, which is Orthodoxy. And from this point of view, Belarus, Georgia, Serbia, Cyprus are the best examples. Also, we see that in some cases, RT is gaining more popularity than it was before. The Russian point of view is, let's say, copied and pasted in some Balkan countries, especially Serbia. We see traditional indifference towards the thing that happened in the western part of Europe. For example, in Italy. In Italy, for example, Mrs. Justina would agree with me. I'm pretty sure that quite a lot of pro-Chinese narratives are widespread there because of the close cooperation between Rai 1, Rai 2, Rai 3 with the Chinese TV stations and televisions. We see quite a superficial attitude toward the ongoing war in Ukraine in the countries like Spain, like Portugal, where traditionally the interest is quite low. Well, I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about the measures, how these challenges might be, let's say, countered by different states and think tanks. That's why I stop here and let you continue the discussion.
Okay, Justina, you wanted to add something.
Yes, if I may, very briefly, because we are talking about this industry of disinformation when it comes to Russia. So I started to think if China has this industry, and I would like to say yes, China has this industry, but it is a little different situation, the different goals, because China's disinformation industry is really well developed when it comes to Taiwan. And Taiwan, for us, should be also be. We should, if we would like to know what may happen in China's disinformation in Europe, in the Western countries, in a few years, because we right now is thinking about possible, let's say, conflict in the Taiwan Strait. So we should also look what China is doing when it comes to the disinformation about Taiwan, because it's very important. Of course, we are talking right now about war in Ukraine because of Russia's aggression, and of course, Russia is the most, let's say, interested in this disinformation. China is more sophisticated, but I would like to say that China has this industry as well, but it's focused right now on Taiwan and will be focused mostly on Taiwan because of the situation which is going on right now, but because also Russia's invasion of Ukraine.
Well,
Yeah.
can I add something?
Now I started the discussion between the between your now Martina and Grigol, please.
Thank you. We just want to share so much with you. No, this actually inspired me to share something that we saw as far as Russia-China alignment is concerned. Actually, way before the war of aggression that Russia waged this year. So as much as we know about this, say, relationship between Russia and China in the information space as being opportunistic, really, it's not systematic, it's not systemic, it's rather about jumping on certain opportunities. And one of the opportunities is, for Russia, it's Taiwan, and for China, it's Ukraine, actually, in the sense, and that happened, we published an article on that in 2019 on EU versus Info, for example, how the Chinese, as we call it, ecosystem, peddled narratives kind of comparing Ukraine to Taiwan. So, you know, hitting two birds with one stone, so to speak, implementing its own strategy towards Taiwan and then helping out Russia with its narratives about Ukraine. So I think this is a very telling example. And also, as far as what Russia and China are after in the information space, I think one of the most distinctive issue that between them is that for China, but please correct me if I'm wrong, obviously you're the expert on this. For China, it's still very important how it is perceived by the international community. So those attempts to criticize China are, if China is able to do it also in the information space, are kind of, you know, thrown back, are hidden. Whereas Russia really doesn't care about that anymore at all. It's, for Russia, it's more about chaos, confusion, and really implementing the zero end game where whatever is bad for Russia is good for the West, whatever is good for Russia is bad for the West.
Okay, and Grigol?
And also, I'd like to add a couple of words about the quite popular propagandistic direction of the Russian Federation, which is the disinformation about Poland, that Poland is going to annex the western part of Ukraine. And this narrative is repeated over and over in various, let's say, by various marginal media outlets and pseudo-information agencies, by trolls. But by the way, there were some tricks and tips how to identify that these guys are trolls, because mainly they post by using Google Translate or by using wrong grammar forms. For example, in case of Polish language, in case of Georgian language, because most of them are foreigners.
Perhaps really important. Okay, I would like to pass the floor to your questions, and then I hope, I think that we will still have something to share with you. Yes.
Sorry, my name's Sandra from Keeping Channels Open,
Yeah.
New Dialogue Network. I just wanted to ask about using more Russian speakers to convey our points of view. And is that like a real strategy now? Because it's not like you see it that much in the media, but if we were to use more Russian dissidents from Russia itself, from Belarus, from Kazakhstan, to speak out, the ones in Georgia as well, wouldn't it be really more compelling to be hearing from, in their language, from their point of view, what the truth is? And wouldn't that be a very good strategy? And also for China, I mean, I don't know so much about China, but shouldn't we be using more Chinese speakers to convey a Western perspective, if you like? And secondly, the OSCE's role. I did work for OSCE once. They've had so many monitors in eastern Ukraine for several years, yet we don't hear enough from OSCE that there is not a genocide going on of Russian speakers. And why is not, I know the OSCE is limited, but this is a moment to really hear from someone like OSCE, who have monitors in the region, to say, no, there's no genocide of Russian speakers.
Martina and Grigol.
Please.
As far as Russian speakers are concerned, yes, we do support Russian independent media, for example, and we do feel that they know best how to approach their audiences, Russian-speaking audiences. So this is going on as much as this is possible, of course. We are, however, also very much aware of how limited the information space is in Russia these days. So it's only, well, as much as you can do. The thing is, and well, the polls were mentioned already, and as much salt as we need to take them with, so to speak, they do show us a very worrisome picture. Even if this does not go to the level of beliefs, well, apparently most Russians really don't want to seek credible information and don't want to really, well, believe in the facts, and they are not looking for them actively. The thing is that when in Russia you need to really make an effort to find credible information these days, also given that you can actually go to prison for speaking the truth. So this all, you know, those information are a foundation of what we are trying to do, and of course there are many limits to what we can do towards Russian audiences, but we do what we can. I think I'll stop there. As far as the OSCE, I couldn't agree more. And as far as I know, there are regular reports still published by the OSCE. The thing is, this is, you know, a general problem when dealing with disinformation. Factual information gets, it's much more problematic to get factual information out there in the information space for it to be as attractive and as shareable with the wider audience. And there was even research done in 2018 by the Oxford Internet Institute. Colleagues actually counted, and on average, the truth is being circulated 6 times more slowly than disinformation. So, you know, it all, I think this is one of the reasons why very credible and absolutely worth our attention reports sometimes just don't make their way to the wider public, unfortunately.
Well, also, I would add a couple of words. Yes, as far as the Russian, say, dissidents are concerned, they're, from my personal point of view, quite supported by different Western think tanks, organizations, but still, their dimension is quite limited, because those Russian citizens of the Russian Federation who live inside the country are limited, because information sources are strictly controlled. Every social network almost is blocked. And as for those Russians who fled the country, the majority of them, from the experience of Georgia, I can say they don't care about politics. They're mainly concentrated on daily problems. And as for others, it was a paradox for me to see hundreds, no, thousands of Russians who were supporting Putin in Berlin. I know plenty of Russians who live in New York from 2002 and still remain pro-Putinist activists. So that's the topic of, let's say, more profound research.
If I may add one thing to that picture. Last time I was discussing with the journalist from Insider, Russian journalists who are living now in Warsaw, and they were quite frustrated because some Russians are reading their news, but only part of Russians are reading the papers, and they cannot convince the rest. So they have like blockade how to convince others. So they are trying to different messages, put different agenda to those who, and they name it like actively do not want to hear them about the war, about the pictures of bombing cities, people in Ukraine. And that was also something difficult difficult, I cannot find the proper word, because at the beginning of invasion, Russian authorities block Instagram and Twitter, because actually they were thinking that Russian citizens will be shocked on messages and pictures from the war in Ukraine. But after a while, they actually understood that those pictures did not shock people. And now they freely spread, they even can spread those pictures and show on the prime news that yes, we are bombing cities, and you can freely share those. You can see in outlets of prime time that they are bombing Ukrainian whole country, and nothing is happening, right? People are not going out, and they are, because they are fighting with Nazis. So actually what those people from Insider, they said me, I really remember the sentence that Russians are actively opposing knowing the truth. So they are having such a thing like in the psychology, you know, there is a thing that you actively don't want to know the truth.
And then also, though, there are... Sorry, I meant also, I understand the problem of reaching Russian citizens and the fact they already have their views, but there are Russian speakers all across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet states, and we have to reach them as well. And that's why I
and it's happening, actually. It's happening because there is a Medusa, there is a lots of Russian-speaking media, there is still YouTube, and there is a lots of bloggers, and also they are quite active, and I think that still they are sending messages, and those, yeah, sorry.
Sorry.
I'm not the speaker.
One more thing and a question. Do you really think that if Russians know, I mean, the whole population of the Russia, if they know about the atrocities committed by the Russian Federation, will they react? Because looking at the history of Russia, all the changes that were achieved thanks to the direct, let's say, participation of the political elite, not of the people, because there is no civil society in Russia, because it is quite much betterly described by Peter Pomerantsev in his marvelous book, Nothing is True, Everything is Possible. And that's why I think that the main focus should be done on the political elite, which may change the regime, and we may benefit from this change, not on the people. That's my personal opinion.
Yeah, sure. Okay, so we have here and there. Okay.
Thank you very much. Grzegorz Stec, Mercator Institute for China Studies. I would have two questions, and sorry if they're going to be a little bit long, but one related to the question of efficiency of information and manipulation. How do we really gauge it? And the question of agency of the recipients. Because here I wanted to refer, Justina, to the points that you made on nuclear and mediation, which is, of course, a troubling point for, I think, all of us looking at China, how those things keep coming back. But I wanted to ask, is this for sure, and it's a slightly provocative question deliberately, is it really the sign of Chinese information manipulation being successful? Because are those narratives just passively embraced also by our leaders? Or is it possibility that they are seeking to create in their mind some sort of diplomatic leverage? Or, for example, that there is a possibility that they are treated as enablers, that those narratives are just embraced for the sake of reopening with China of diplomatic relations or something else. You need a fig leaf for that, and maybe that could be the cover. So that would, to me, be a question. Can you elaborate a bit more on how do we really define the efficiency of those narratives, and what is the role of agency of the recipients? And the second question, and that would be to Ms. Biljukiewicz, what are the key limitations that we are now facing in terms of addressing the foreign information manipulation and interference? Because I would assume that the response on our side should be about, of course, improving the democratic resilience. But what is the problem here, the key problem? Is it about the resources? Is it about the political will and participation of elites? Or is it just a matter of time that we're putting mechanisms in place and they still are yet to kick in? And here I just wanted to refer to, for example, the EU's strategic compass, because of course we have the new upcoming toolbox, anti-foreign interference, and there was also the mention of question of information manipulation there. But still, we have a clear passage on the fact that the question of attribution remains a prerogative of member states. So again, looking from the Chinese perspective, or rather from the perspective of a person working on China, I think there is already an embrace of the fact that we can call Russia out. When it comes to China, it's much more politically sensitive. So that's why I wanted to ask you, what is the key limitation that you would see for us going forward? Thank you.
Oh, yeah, we will call, let's collect questions and then we will, we will
Thank you.
then answer.
Peter Brossen with RUSI here in Brussels. So, question maybe both on definition and then practice, difference between information and disinformation. So, when we see somebody with opposing views or perceptions, we often end up in conflict, and when we're in conflict, those biases and perceptions are exaggerated. So my question is, in your work, how do you define the difference between information, perception, disinformation? Where is the line? And then the more practical question, do we need to bring the other side to our truth in order to have a debate, or do we need to somehow acknowledge the other one's perceptions? And I'm fully with you where we are with Russia and Chinese disinformation, but I'm a conflict management person first, and I know that you need somehow to move in tandem in order to move forward. Or maybe that's not the case in disinformation. There's the truth, and then there's the other side.
You have particular question to someone or
no,
in general?
Sorry, maybe it's mostly to Martina, because
okay.
you work in that space of,
sure.
of defining where it is. Thank you.
Okay, and your question?
I'm Dorka Tokachi from CID, and my question would be that what to do if in a given country the biggest distributor of propaganda and fake news is the government itself, and I'm thinking about Hungary at the moment. So eventually we can see the same tropes that China is using, that you have mentioned, and that Russia is used by the Hungarian government and the propaganda empire. What can be done?
Okay, could it be to you to go group? No. Okay, Justina will take.
Okay, so maybe I will start. I would like to also refer to the previous question about this outreach to the Chinese people. I think it's extremely difficult right now under Xi Jinping, under this excessive control over society after the Party Congress, that we know not what is going on. And to be honest, it's I'm not if it would be even if we could any kind of channels to reach them. If Chinese people is really interested in what is going on in Ukraine. We have a good example of their latest protests because they are really fed up with these restrictions because of COVID. And in that sense, Chinese are pretty eager to protest or something and to express its dissatisfaction. But I'm not sure if they are really, interested in a such big way as that about this Ukraine. So I agree that it's better to communicate to the decision makers, to Chinese decision makers about it. And maybe you will be surprised, but I think that it was part of the success, from my point of view, good on a plus of the Charles Michel visit to China was that he was outspoken in a very blunt way. He repeated that Russia is an aggressor, about Russia's atrocities. So this is and it was a message during the press conference that Chinese journalists may listen to what he was talking about, and he said that he also said it openly to Xi Jinping. And if I may, just the last sentence about the role of experts. To be frank, in the last 3 weeks, there are more Zoom meetings with Chinese experts. And we are trying to say very openly that China is an aggressor, that Russia is an aggressor, that Russia is killing people, innocent people, children, women, pregnant women, bombing hospitals. And I think just to say openly what Russia is doing and to convey the message. I do hope that they are aware of what is going on, but what they are talking about is because they must say it in this way. So this is my hope. About this efficiency, I know that it's difficult to say if it's effective, how to measure this effectiveness, especially it's the same story with the soft power, how to measure soft power, if it's effective or not. But I think that the fact that some journalists, but also leaders, buy Chinese narrative that China is neutral, that China could be a mediator, that China calls for ceasefire, is a kind of a success. And why China is different from Russia, as Ms. Belgiukevich mentioned, that for Russia it's okay that Russia is not trying to be soft. In case of China, China is still thinking about its image. I think that the reason why Xi Jinping right now launched this smiling diplomacy is because he does not want to be portrayed as a 100% perceived as Russia. That China is Russia exactly, is the same let's say goals and the same ways of behavior. And why also China is trying to present its smiling face, I think because there is a kind of a change of the reason why China endorses Russia and Russia's invasion. There is a kind of meta reason is, of course, this anti-Western, anti-U.S. sentiment, the fact that it's U.S.-led, rules-based international order, is a democracy, which is, let's say, pose a challenge to China as authoritarian/totalitarian country, is the same with Russia. Russia is the biggest political friend. But at the very beginning, when China decided to endorse Russia, at the beginning, just before the aggression and after the aggression, I think it was a kind of let's say, China was to some extent proactive. It was like deterrence, I think, just to let Russia do dirty work in Europe, entangle the United States, because the United States will be preoccupied with Europe and Russia and will not be looking at what China is doing. Give China time, or buy China time to prepare better for the upcoming crisis. And of course, it is good the West will be weakened. Maybe they will send some weapons to Ukraine, so military will be weakened. So it's good. But because of the Western unity, the fact that we are united not only when it comes to Ukraine, United States, EU, but also like-minded countries in Asia-Pacific, Australia, Japan, which is front-runner when it comes to sanctions in Asian countries, Taiwan, South Korea, even Singapore in ASEAN grouping, which is, let's say, in the middle. But Singapore said openly that condemned Russia. So China is now aware that is a kind of a bloc, anti-Chinese, anti-Russian, anti-authoritarian bloc. And what China is doing right now is a kind of a resilience, is like a defensive mode. So this is the reason why China started to smile in order, because we would like to see some cracks on this, let's say, Western, collective West, or how call it, democratic bloc, I think. So, once and the last one, I promise, the last one about the effectiveness about this Chinese propaganda, because we are talking about and disinformation as a, from the outside world, not in China, but what struck me in the last few webinars with Chinese people, and also listening to the press conference during Michelle's visit to Beijing, that they are believing, Chinese are believing, that it's really bad situation here because of energy crisis. And I had it 3 times that China is really helping us because they are sending us electric blankets. And it was said, really, by one of the journalists from Caixin during the Michelle visit, during the press conference, and I had it 2 or 3 times having this webinars with Chinese people, Chinese experts, that it's a disaster here because of high energy prices, and they are sending us electric blankets. So in that sense, I think this Chinese disinformation is also to some extent effective inside China.
Okay, thank you very much. And now maybe in the order would be Martyna Bildziukiewicz, perhaps.
Okay, so on key limitations in addressing FIMI, of course, we would very much appreciate more resources. We would very much appreciate more human resources as well. However, I need to say that we really learned a lesson as the EU in the recent years, and our situation has been much better, and it has been improving every year, really. Even though, you know, we spoke before about the whole ecosystem of disinformation, so, you know, when you realize you're up against really something quite significant, you will always need more resources to deal with that. Nevertheless, I think we're in a very, very different place, and one of the hardest lessons was the pandemic, indeed, as was mentioned also before, and it was a key moment for us to really build the whole system of response more effectively, and more on that very soon. Before I get into that, I wanted also to say that, well, unfortunately, it took a brutal war of aggression this year for some of the decision makers to realize what we're up against, but we are there. And there is political will, and really the level of understanding how this information works and what it is about is so much different than it was a year ago. And I think the sanctions, although I don't want to, you know, I don't want you to leave with an impression that we only impose sanctions and that's it. So I will elaborate a little bit on what we do. But the sanctions are a very good example of how far we've gone since last year, because really, if we had this debate in December 2021, and I would say here, well, maybe we should impose sanctions on disinformation outlets, people would go like, no, freedom of speech, no, never. But now it's actually very, very clear that the freedom of speech is also about protecting ourselves from disinformation and manipulation. And I will come back to that when I answer your question as well. But first, on FIMI, which is foreign information manipulation and interference, if you didn't know that, we tend to use it more these days than disinformation, and there are particular reasons for that. So the FIMI toolbox, that is part of the strategic compass, and please forgive me, I'm representing the EU, we love acronyms. So this is, the FIMI toolbox is based on 4 pillars, and those pillars are really happening already. So we think of the toolbox as kind of making the whole response to disinformation, information manipulation more orderly, if you like. And here it would be up to member states to bring this forward. Nevertheless, all of those pillars that I'm now going to mention, these are things that are already happening. So first of all, there's situational awareness, which means that we really need to understand the threat and understand what is happening in the information space every day in possibly as many corners of the information space as possible in order to take action. So this is what situational awareness is about, and we share this, share what we know with the member states through rapid alert system and via other means, also with the bigger community, which we call like-minded community. So this is G7, for example. These are our colleagues in NATO, a few other countries as well. Secondly, and well, coming from the EU versus Info project, I think this is one of the essential parts of the toolbox. It's resilience building. So on the one hand, these are projects like EU versus Disinfo, raising awareness about disinformation, about how it works, but this is also about education, about trainings, about all those things that help us understand and act. We also do a lot of activities towards, well, in case of my team, this is towards the Eastern Partnership region and Central Asia to some extent. So we bring together fact checkers, journalists, civil society organizations, and we try to give them the tools so that to fight disinformation, to analyze it, to understand it, to fight back, so that then they can bring the knowledge further towards their audiences and people in their countries. The third pillar is the diplomatic response. So jointly, and this goes back also to part of your question about attribution. Yes, with Russia we came a long way. With China, maybe not such a long way, but also I think again the level of awareness about China's actions is much bigger than ever. And also my team is part of the wider strategic communications division, which also comprises a small but growing team that is dealing with China precisely. And then the fourth pillar is disruption. So these are sanctions, and the work and the discussion is ongoing with the member states on what else we can do in order to disrupt the disinformation, information manipulation activities. So I would say really we have been building the whole response system for a few years now, and we're really in a very different place. What I think we should do a little bit differently, and we are getting there, I think. This is one of the soft measures. This is on the communication side. So disinformation is quite often about emotions. And it's also about feeding on the divisions that already are existing in our communities. And given that, we also need to respond when we do our communication. We need to respond also with emotions, not only respond, we need to kind of, we use the term occupy the information space. So we need to be there in the information space more, and we need to be there fast and first. And right now, I think this is one of the very vulnerable moments of this war as far as the Europeans are concerned. Because we're tired a little bit, let's face this. We're also unsure what's going to happen. We see the energy and food prices really at enormous levels, and this all makes us much more vulnerable to disinformation, and Russia knows this very, very well. And so we also need to, as the EU, in our communication efforts, not shy away from that. Actually talk to the Europeans and remind them with emotions and with messages based on our own identity, on our values, that, we're in this war, we support Ukraine in this war, for a very wide variety of reasons, and so I think we should, as the EU, do a bit of a better job on this front. Actually, then there was still a question about definitions.
Yeah,
I
please.
know I've been talking long enough.
Yeah, we are a bit up front of time, so please.
The last question about Hungary, yes?
Yeah, but
So just very shortly, I will happily engage with you if you have time after the debate. The main difference between information and disinformation, or the main issue with disinformation, the main notion behind it, is the manipulative intent. So there is no accidents, no coincidence behind it. There is a manipulative intent to disrupt the discussion, to drive wedges, to feed on divisions, to create confusion and chaos. This is the most important part.
Thank you very much, Martina. And now, actually, we have, unfortunately, Yeah, unfortunately, we cannot take more questions because actually we are run of time. But we do have a question from the audience, virtual audience, and I will add to the question to the Hungary because we have a question to Poland. And I know that in your book you are comparing Visegrad Group. To your question about Hungary, I will add question from the virtual audience because there is a question about Poland. So if you can compare those two countries, please do.
Well, the case of Hungary is very interesting because once the country which was the example of democratic transformation, a pillar of democracy in Central Europe, has become one of the most controversial states on our continent.
And you have 5 minutes, sorry.
Yes. And once Daniel Hegedus described this transformation as the result of corruption, and I remind you that several very controversial deals were signed between Orban's government and the Russian Federation. Paksh nuclear plant agreement, the renovation of Budapest Metropolitan, and the gas deal with Gazprom. Owing to these agreements and business deals, Hungarian political elite become more attached to Russian, and right now Viktor Orban's government is doing the same things as Karin Davisha in her marvelous book Putin's Kleptocracy. She describes the first 500 days of Vladimir Putin while he became the president. Viktor Orban is doing the same things over the past 10 or 12 years. And unfortunately, political elite as well became quite pro-Russian from not only Fidesz but also Jobbik political party. So how can we find the solution from this quite complicated situation? Well, to my humble mind, I think that the solution should be searched in the consequences and outcomes of this war, because many things will define the results of this war, not only in Russia, not only in Ukraine, but also in Hungary as well, because Viktor Orban and his government is perceived and supposed to be the keen ally of Kremlin in Europe, the so-called Trojan horse. And I'm pretty sure that in case if Russia does not win, and Russia will not win this war, I'm pretty sure in this, it is already visible, the positions of Viktor Orban will be weakened. Also within the European Union and also in Hungary. Apart from that, the main and the most important solution in this case is, of course, political change. And this political change may become reality, because I remember what was the situation in Slovakia when Robert Fico seemed to be undefeatable. He was, an absolute champion, but he lost the elections. As for Poland, Poland is, let's say, exception from this point of view, because this is the only country where the Russian propaganda does not work. Many, or at least the impact of the Russian propaganda is very limited, and different researchers show it. From this point of view, the Globsec vulnerability index is a perfect publication. And the main reason of this inefficiency, in my opinion, is the Polish national identity, which is the best immunity to the efficiency or inefficiency of the Russian propaganda.
Thank you very much. My conclusions will be short. Russians and Chinese are cooperating with each other when it comes to propaganda and disinformation, especially regarding Ukraine. Do not be fooled by smiling face of Chinese government. Read carefully statements from Chinese officials. And thank you very much for your attention, being with us personally and virtually. Thank you very much for your questions, and thank you, my speakers, for your very good insights, and wish you us fighting with all those spreading disinformation and propaganda. Thank you all for being here.